London in the spring of 1817 carried the scent of promise through its streets, blossoms unfurling in the squares, while the machinery of power turned steadily within the ancient walls of Westminster. Eleanor Whitmore sat in the gallery of the House of Lords, tucked into the shadowed corner of Lady Ashworth's box, precisely where a paid companion belonged, present but invisible, necessary but unacknowledged. She had perfected this art over 6 years of service, the ability to fade into upholstery and paneling, to become merely another fixture in the background of wealth and consequence. At 28, she had long accepted what mirrors and society confirmed. She possessed neither beauty nor fortune, those twin currencies that might purchase a woman's visibility. Her figure was too thin, her features too angular, her complexion too pale from years spent indoors attending to the whims of others. The gallery hummed with the muted conversations of observers, mostly men of business and a scattering of ladies come to watch their husbands or sons perform on the political stage. Below, the chamber glowed with afternoon light filtering through high windows, illuminating the ranks of peers in their formal dress. The Marquess of Ravenscroft stood at the dispatch box, a figure of such assured command that even from her distant perch Eleanor could feel the weight of his presence. William Thornhill possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that suggested marble statuary, all clean lines and aristocratic reserve, his dark hair silvering slightly at the temples, though he could not be much past 35. His voice carried with practiced authority as he addressed the assembly on the matter of estate reform, proposing measures to improve tenant conditions and agricultural innovation. Eleanor listened with genuine interest, for she had read extensively on such matters, the books in Lady Ashworth's library serving as both escape and education during long evenings of solitude. Then it happened, the moment that would alter everything. The Marquess, warming to his subject, declared with perfect sincerity that landowners must learn to understand the daily struggles of those who worked their fields, that only through such understanding could true progress be achieved. He gestured toward the gilded chamber, the velvet benches, the coroneted heads surrounding him, seeming utterly unconscious of the irony. The laugh escaped Eleanor before she could prevent it, a brief musical sound of genuine amusement, unguarded and entirely inappropriate. In the acoustics of that solemn space, it carried like a bell. William Thornhill stopped mid-sentence, the thread of his rhetoric severed cleanly. His head turned toward the gallery, dark eyes searching, and Eleanor felt the precise moment his gaze found her. She sat frozen, her lips still curved in the remnant of that involuntary smile, and watched something extraordinary happen to his controlled features. Confusion flickered first, then a kind of startled recognition, as though he had discovered something unexpected and precious in a familiar room. Time suspended itself in amber. The chamber held its breath. And the Marquess of Ravenscroft, who had never in his political career lost command of his words, stood utterly silent, his prepared speech forgotten, able only to stare at the unremarkable woman in the shadows, whose laughter had somehow pierced straight through to something he had not known was waiting. The suspended moment shattered like dropped crystal, and the chamber erupted into murmurs that swelled like a wave breaking against stone. Eleanor watched in horror as the Marquess blinked, seeming to recall himself and his surroundings, his hand gripping the edge of the dispatch box as though anchoring himself to something solid. He cleared his throat, the sound carrying in the suddenly attentive silence, and attempted to locate his place in the abandoned speech. The words came now with visible effort, the smooth authority fractured into something more hesitant, more human. He concluded his remarks with none of the eloquence that had characterized the beginning, his final arguments compressed and hurried, and when he sat down, the applause was scattered and uncertain. Lady Ashworth's fingers closed around Eleanor's wrist like a vice, nails pressing through the thin fabric of her sleeve. The hiss of disapproval came low and venomous. They would speak of this later, that tone promised, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist with dread. She kept her eyes lowered as they rose to leave, navigating the gallery stairs in Lady Ashworth's furious wake, acutely aware of the stares that followed them, the whispered speculation. Outside, the spring air felt too bright, too cheerful for the mortification that burned through her chest. In the carriage, Eleanor sat in her customary corner, hands folded tightly in her lap, preparing for the onslaught. Lady Ashworth delivered it in clipped syllables, each word a small blade. The embarrassment, the presumption, the unsuitability of drawing attention in such a manner. Eleanor apologized repeatedly, mechanically, while her mind catalogued the likely consequences. She was 28 years old, possessed neither family nor fortune, and her only currency was her discretion and usefulness. She had just spent both in a single thoughtless moment. Another position would be difficult to secure without a reference, and Lady Ashworth's references, when displeased, could be damning through faint praise alone. She thought of the small room that had been her home for 6 years, the borrowed books that had been her consolation, the carefully maintained invisibility that had been her protection. All of it threatened now by a laugh she had not been able to contain. Yet beneath the fear and shame, something else flickered, small and stubborn as a candle flame in wind. The memory of the Marquess's face in that moment when his eyes found hers, the startled recognition there, as though she had somehow become visible in a way she had never been before. It meant nothing, of course. Men of his station did not truly see women of hers, but for that suspended instant, she had felt seen, and the sensation had been extraordinary. Meanwhile, in the now emptying chamber of the House of Lords, William Thornhill sat motionless in his seat long after his colleagues had departed for their clubs and correspondence. His hands rested on his knees, and he stared at nothing, replaying that sound. Genuine laughter, unguarded and bright, cutting through years of calculated performance and political theatre. He could not remember the last time he had heard anything so real. That evening at Lady Ashworth's townhouse on Berkeley Square, Eleanor stood in the drawing-room with her hands clasped before her, spine straight despite the trembling in her limbs, while her employer paced the length of the Aubusson carpet with the measured fury of a general surveying a battlefield loss. The scolding came in waves, each more cutting than the last, a catalogue of Eleanor's presumption and thoughtlessness, the embarrassment inflicted not only upon Lady Ashworth herself but upon her entire household, the impropriety of drawing attention in such a public forum, the unsuitability of a woman in her position making herself conspicuous in any manner whatsoever. Eleanor apologized with each pause for breath, the words mechanical and small. "Yes, my lady, and I am deeply sorry, my lady, and it will never happen again, my lady," while inside her chest something twisted with the sick certainty of consequences yet to fall. She had expected immediate dismissal, the swift severing that would leave her adrift in a city that devoured women without resources, but Lady Ashworth was possessed of a more calculating temperament. Dismissal would require explanation, would invite gossip, would connect the Ashworth name more firmly to the parliamentary incident that was doubtless already circulating through the clubs and drawing-rooms like autumn leaves on wind. Instead, Lady Ashworth pronounced her punishment with cold precision. Eleanor would catalogue the entire library, a task postponed for 3 years, involving hundreds of volumes in multiple languages, their condition assessed and recorded, their placement reorganized according to a new system Lady Ashworth had only just decided upon. It would take weeks, possibly months, and would keep Eleanor occupied and invisible, confined to the back reaches of the house, where her presence could not prove further embarrassing. Eleanor received this sentence with lowered eyes and murmured gratitude, though gratitude felt like ash on her tongue, and when finally dismissed, she climbed the servants' stairs to her small room under the eaves with legs that felt insubstantial as water. The room was neat and spare, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a trunk for her few possessions, and a single shelf of books borrowed from the library she would now spend her days cataloguing. She sat on the edge of the bed and removed her spectacles, pressing her fingers against her closed eyes until colors bloomed in the darkness. Mortification burned through her, the memory of those stares in the gallery, the whispers that had followed their exit, the weight of Lady Ashworth's disappointment settling around her shoulders like a yoke. Yet beneath the shame, persistent as a heartbeat, came that other feeling, the one she hardly dared examine. The memory of the Marquess's face when his gaze found hers, the suspended moment when the entire chamber had seemed to recede, and there had been only those dark eyes and the startled recognition in them, as though he had seen something unexpected and somehow significant. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly, replacing her spectacles and standing to prepare for bed, her movements automatic with long practice. Men of his rank did not truly see women of hers. Not really. Not in any way that mattered beyond a moment's curiosity. But as she lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, she could not prevent her mind from returning to that instant of visibility, and the small, stubborn flame of something that felt dangerously like hope refused to be entirely extinguished. William Thornhill sat at the broad mahogany desk in his study at Ravenscroft House, correspondence stacked before him in neat piles organized by his secretary, according to urgency and subject, yet the words on the pages refused to resolve into meaning. He would read the same sentence 3 times and find at the end that his mind had retained nothing, that it had wandered instead back to that moment in the House of Lords, replaying with vivid precision the sound of laughter cutting through the practiced rhetoric and calculated performance that had characterized his adult life. It had been unaffected, genuine, spontaneous, all the things that his world so carefully polished away, and it had arrested him as completely as a hand laid against his chest. His secretary, Patterson, a man of 40 years who had served the Thornhill family since William's father held the title, made careful note of this distraction, his glances growing more concerned as the afternoon wore toward evening, and his lordship continued to stare at documents without truly seeing them. William rose finally and moved to the window overlooking the street, watching carriages pass in the spring twilight, and allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. He could not forget her face. Not merely the laughter, though that remained vivid as a bell tone in memory, but the face itself, the features society would dismiss as unremarkable, but which had struck him with unexpected force. There had been intelligence in those eyes behind the spectacles, a spark of genuine response, and he found himself wanting, with an intensity that surprised and unsettled him, to know what thoughts had prompted that laugh. What perspectives saw irony where he had intended earnestness. He returned to his desk and did something he had never done before in matters personal. He employed his position for information. A discreet inquiry to an acquaintance who tracked the movements of the ton, a casual question about who had occupied Lady Ashworth's box that afternoon. The answer came within the hour. Eleanor Whitmore, paid companion, 28 years of age, no family of consequence, no fortune, a woman society would consider beneath notice. The description should have ended his curiosity, should have relegated the moment to an amusing aberration. Yet it did not. Instead, he found the details making her more rather than less vivid, filling in the outline of a life lived at the margins of the world he inhabited. A woman who attended Parliament, not as participant, but as accessory to her employer's social activities, who sat in galleries and witnessed the machinery of power without ever touching its levers, who read and thought and observed from a position of imposed invisibility. He wondered what she had read, what shaped her perspective, what she thought of the men who made speeches about the struggles of people they would never meet while sitting in chambers decorated with gold leaf and ancestral privilege. The hypocrisy she had laughed at was one he had never quite articulated to himself, cushioned as he was by birthright and expectation, and her response had opened a door in his thinking he had not known was closed. He made his decision with the same directness he applied to matters of estate and policy. He would call on Lady Ashworth, would use the convenient excuse of discussing her charitable patronage, a cause she supported with more enthusiasm than discernment, and he would contrive some reason to encounter Miss Whitmore again. It was irregular, perhaps, but he found he did not care. That laugh had woken something in him, and he needed to understand what and why. 3 days later, when the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the Ashworth townhouse and illuminated the dust motes dancing above the library shelves where Eleanor stood balanced on the 4th rung of the rolling ladder, she heard the commotion of arrival echo through the marble entrance hall below and felt her heart contract with an instinct she could not name. The measured tones of Billings the butler, the sudden quickening of servant footsteps, the particular quality of activity that attended a caller of consequence, all filtered up through the floors of the house to reach her in her exile among the books. She froze with a volume of agricultural theory in her hands, listening, and when she heard Lady Ashworth's voice rising in pleased surprise, followed by the deeper register of a male voice she recognized with a clarity that sent heat flooding through her, she considered for one wild moment climbing down and fleeing to her room under the eaves. Instead, she remained motionless, pressed against the shelves, as though she might render herself invisible through stillness alone. While in the drawing-room 2 floors below, William Thornhill accepted tea and exchanged pleasantries with a woman who had no notion he had come seeking not her patronage, but a glimpse of her overlooked companion. He maneuvered the conversation with the skill of long practice in parliamentary strategy, speaking of charitable initiatives and estate improvements, mentioning in passing the recent session at the House of Lords, watching Lady Ashworth's expression shift from pleasure to wariness at the reference. She apologized with the excessive concern of one who fears social consequences, assuring him that her companion had been thoroughly reprimanded for the unseemly disruption, that Miss Whitmore understood the gravity of her lapse in decorum. William received this with a slight smile that transformed his austere features into something warmer, more approachable, and told Lady Ashworth with perfect sincerity that he had found the moment more refreshing than offensive. That genuine response was so rare in the calculated atmosphere of political theatre. Lady Ashworth, uncertain how to interpret this, laughed nervously and steered conversation toward safer ground, but William had already prepared his opening. He mentioned casually that he had heard she possessed a particularly comprehensive collection on modern agricultural methods, specifically a volume by Arthur Young that he had been seeking, and might he impose upon her hospitality to examine her library. The request was irregular, but not impossibly so, and Lady Ashworth, relieved that he harbored no anger, and flattered by his interest in her late husband's collection, rose immediately to escort him personally to the library. Eleanor heard their approach, their voices growing clearer as they climbed the stairs, and knew there was no escape, no way to avoid the encounter that was bearing down upon her with the inevitability of a wave reaching shore. She straightened her spine and kept her eyes fixed on the book in her hands, though the words had ceased to hold any meaning, and waited with her heart beating so loudly she was certain it must be audible in the sudden quiet that fell when Lady Ashworth opened the library door and discovered her companion precisely where she should be, fulfilling her punishment, surrounded by the leather spines and paper testimonies of other people's thoughts. Lady Ashworth swept into the library with the confidence of ownership, her silk skirts rustling against the doorframe, speaking over her shoulder to her distinguished guest about the comprehensiveness of the collection her late husband had assembled. But her words died mid-sentence when she perceived the figure on the ladder, and her expression shifted from gracious hostess to displeased employer in the space of a breath. Eleanor turned at the sound of voices, the volume of agricultural theory still clutched in her hands, and for a moment existed in a space between hope that she might somehow remain unnoticed and the certain knowledge that discovery was complete. Her spectacles had indeed slipped down her nose during her reaching, and she felt rather than saw the smudge of dust on her cheek, the disarray of her hair where it had escaped its pins, the overall impression of a woman caught in the undignified act of labor rather than the decorative stillness society preferred in females. William Thornhill stood framed in the doorway behind Lady Ashworth, taller than Eleanor remembered, his dark coat perfectly tailored across shoulders that suggested a man who did more than sit in parliamentary chambers. And when his eyes found hers across the book-lined space, she felt the same jolt that had arrested her in the gallery 3 days prior, a recognition that bypassed rational thought and struck somewhere deeper. Lady Ashworth recovered her composure with visible effort and made introductions with the curtness of one forced to acknowledge what she would prefer to ignore, her tone conveying that Miss Whitmore was engaged in assigned duties and should not be considered part of the social interaction. Eleanor descended the ladder with as much grace as circumstances allowed, her movements awkward under the weight of observation, and executed a curtsy that felt inadequate to the moment, her eyes fixed on the carpet at the Marquess's feet, because meeting his gaze seemed both impossible and dangerous. She murmured the appropriate acknowledgement of the introduction, her voice sounding strange in her own ears, tight with the tension of mortification and something else she could not name. William moved further into the room with the ease of a man accustomed to command, his presence seeming to alter the very air, and when he spoke, his voice carried the gentleness Eleanor had not expected, the tone one might use with a startled creature one wished not to frighten further. He addressed her directly, bypassing the social convention that would have kept conversation channeled through Lady Ashworth, asking with what appeared to be genuine curiosity whether she had indeed found his speech at the House of Lords truly amusing. The question hung in the air between them, fraught with implications Eleanor could not fully pass, while Lady Ashworth's sharp intake of breath signalled her shock at this direct engagement. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book she still held, her knuckles whitening against the leather binding, and she understood that this moment required a response, that silence would be its own answer. But her mind raced through possible replies and found each one insufficient to the complexity of what was being asked, what was truly being asked beneath the surface of polite inquiry. Eleanor stood in the center of the library, with the book still clutched against her chest like a shield, and felt the weight of impossibility pressing down upon her as the silence stretched and Lady Ashworth's expectation of proper deference hung in the air like smoke, but something in the Marquess's expression, a quality of genuine inquiry rather than accusation, loosened the tight grip of fear, just enough for a honesty to slip through the cracks of self-preservation. Her voice emerged trembling but clear, the words shaped by years of observing from the margins and understanding truths that those at the center could not see, and she told him that yes, she had found a particular moment amusing, that his comment about landowners needing to understand the daily struggles of their tenants had struck her as deeply ironic when delivered in a chamber dripping with gilt and marble, where men who had never missed a meal debated the hunger of others, where velvet cushions supported lords discussing the hardships of wooden benches. She spoke quickly, the explanation tumbling out before courage could fail, and added that she meant no personal offense, that she was certain he was sincere in his reform efforts. But the contrast between setting and subject had simply overwhelmed her sense of propriety in that unguarded instant. She finished with another apology, her eyes finally lifting to meet his as she braced for the anger that must surely come, for no man of his standing would tolerate such presumption from a woman of her position. But instead of the cold fury she anticipated, William Thornhill did something that transformed the entire atmosphere of the book-lined room and sent Lady Ashworth's hand flying to her throat in shock. He laughed, a sound so genuine and unrestrained that it seemed to surprise him as much as his audience, his head tilting back slightly as the laughter rolled through him and shifted his austere features into an expression of such warmth and vitality that Eleanor felt her breath catch for an entirely different reason than fear. When he recovered and looked at her again, his eyes were bright with something that might have been delight, and he told her with complete sincerity that she was absolutely correct, that he had stood in that ridiculous gilded cage, making pronouncements about poverty, and never once considered how the setting itself undermined every word, that her moment of honest response had done him the considerable service of revealing what weeks of rehearsal and careful political calculation had obscured. He spoke to her directly, ignoring Lady Ashworth's presence entirely now, admitting that authenticity was so rare in his world that he had almost forgotten what it sounded like until her laughter cut through the performance and reminded him that truth still existed somewhere beyond the careful theatre of power. Lady Ashworth watched this exchange with an expression cycling rapidly through confusion, alarm, and a growing calculation that suggested she was reassessing every assumption about what was transpiring in her library, while Eleanor stood motionless, the book still pressed against her chest, trying to comprehend how a moment she had been certain would end in her dismissal had instead become something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of a conversation that might matter. William moved further into the library with the ease of a man accustomed to finding welcome wherever he went, his interest clearly engaged rather than merely polite. And he asked Eleanor if she had formed opinions on the reform proposals currently under debate in Parliament, the question directed to her rather than through Lady Ashworth as propriety would dictate. Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward her employer, whose expression had frozen into something between alarm and calculation. But William waited with an attentiveness that suggested he genuinely wished to hear her response, and she found herself speaking with more confidence than circumstances should have allowed, referencing Adam Smith's observations on the moral sentiments that ought to govern economic relations, then moving to more recent work by Robert Owen on cooperative communities and the responsibility of those with capital toward those who labored to create wealth. Her words came faster as she warmed to the subject, years of solitary reading suddenly finding outlet in actual conversation, and she cited specific passages and arguments with the precision of someone who had engaged these texts deeply and repeatedly, who had used them to construct understanding of a world that had given her much time to observe and little power to influence. William listened with an intensity that seemed to alter the very quality of attention in the room, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was not merely indulging her, but actively thinking alongside her. And when she mentioned a particular treatise on land reform published just the previous year, he expressed surprise and pleasure that she had encountered it, admitting he had found it challenging and provocative, and would value discussing its arguments with someone who had clearly considered them carefully. Lady Ashworth, who had been standing rigid near the doorway, finally interjected with forced brightness to observe that Miss Whitmore had always been a great reader, that the library kept her occupied during the many hours when she was not needed for companionship, the words managing to simultaneously acknowledge Eleanor's intelligence and remind everyone present of her subordinate position. William turned to Lady Ashworth with a courtesy that barely masked his irritation at the interruption, thanking her for maintaining such an excellent collection and for permitting her companion access to it, his phrasing subtly emphasizing that Eleanor's education was something to be credited rather than merely tolerated. Lady Ashworth, recognizing that the conversation had moved into territory she could not navigate, and uncomfortable with the prolonged attention being paid to her paid dependent, redirected by mentioning other volumes the Marquess might find useful and suggesting that if he wished to consult the library further, arrangements could certainly be made. William seized this opening with an alacrity that suggested it was precisely what he had been maneuvering toward, expressing his gratitude and asking if he might return in 2 days hence to examine several texts he had not had opportunity to review today, his eyes moving to Eleanor as he spoke in a way that made clear the books were not his primary interest. Lady Ashworth agreed with the strained graciousness of someone who could not refuse a Marquess but sensed complications gathering, and William took his leave with proper formality, bowing to Lady Ashworth and then, with deliberate equality, to Eleanor, holding her gaze for a moment that seemed to contain entire conversations they had not yet had. After he departed, Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the library, the book still in her hands, feeling his presence lingering in the air, like the warmth that remains in a room after the fire has been banked, and she understood with absolute certainty that something had shifted, that the foundations of her small, carefully managed life had developed cracks through which dangerous possibilities were beginning to seep. William returned to the Ashworth residence 2 days later as promised, arriving in the early afternoon when light streamed through the library windows and turned dust motes into suspended constellations, and Eleanor, who had told herself she would not watch for him, found her attention drawn repeatedly to the sound of carriage wheels on the street, until she finally heard his voice in the entrance hall and felt her pulse quicken in a way that frightened her with its intensity. Lady Ashworth received him with carefully calculated warmth, having decided that his peculiar interest in her companion was eccentric but harmless and might even reflect well on her household's intellectual atmosphere, and she escorted him to the library where Eleanor waited, having arranged herself at the desk with books spread before her in a tableau of industry that she hoped disguised how entirely her thoughts had been occupied with the possibility of this moment. The conversation that afternoon lasted nearly 2 hours, ranging across topics from agricultural innovation to the poetry of Wordsworth, and Eleanor discovered that William possessed not just education, but genuine curiosity, a willingness to question received wisdom that was rare among men of his position, and he in turn found himself drawn deeper into the particular quality of her intelligence, the way she connected ideas across disciplines and saw patterns that others missed. He returned again 3 days after that, and then 4 days later, each visit growing longer as the pretense of consulting specific volumes gave way to something more honest, the simple desire to continue conversations that had become the most engaging part of his week. Eleanor tried to maintain emotional distance, reminding herself each evening that this was temporary, that men like the Marquess did not form lasting attachments to women like her, that she was a curiosity, who would inevitably cease to interest him once the novelty faded. But despite these stern internal lectures, she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the steady pressure of his attention and the dangerous warmth of feeling valued for the contents of her mind rather than dismissed for the plainness of her face. During their 4th meeting, he made her laugh with a wry observation about parliamentary procedure, and the sound seemed to delight him in a way that made her suddenly conscious of how rarely anyone had cared whether she found something amusing, and when she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret, something between wonder and determination, she felt her heart perform a small rebellion against all her sensible resolutions. He began to share aspects of his own experience, the loneliness of a position that required constant performance, the exhaustion of never quite being able to speak freely for fear every word would be weighed for political advantage, and she recognized in his confession a kind of isolation that mirrored her own despite the vast difference in their circumstances. By the end of that week, Eleanor understood that she was in grave danger of losing her heart entirely, and the knowledge filled her with equal measures of terror and something that felt alarmingly like joy, while William found himself anticipating each visit with an intensity that disrupted his concentration on other matters and left his secretary exchanging meaningful glances with the household staff about the Marquess's unprecedented pattern of afternoon absences. The gossip began as such things always do in London society, quietly at first in drawing rooms and at afternoon teas, then gathering momentum like a stone rolling downhill until it seemed everyone was discussing the peculiar frequency with which the Marquess of Ravenscroft had been observed entering the Ashworth residence. Eleanor first became aware of the speculation when she overheard 2 housemaids whispering in the corridor outside the library, their voices carrying the particular quality of excitement that accompanies romantic intrigue, and she heard one say to the other that it was obvious the Marquess was courting Miss Arabella Ashworth, Lady Ashworth's niece, who had arrived from the country 3 weeks prior, and whose beauty had already attracted considerable attention among eligible gentlemen. The maid's companion agreed enthusiastically, noting that the Marquess had impeccable taste, and that Miss Arabella, with her golden hair and perfect complexion, would make a stunning marchioness, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest as she stood frozen on the other side of the door, her hand still raised to turn the handle. She had known, of course she had, known that William's visits could not possibly be for her, that she had been foolish to let herself imagine otherwise even for a moment, and the servant's conversation merely confirmed what logic had been telling her all along, even as her treacherous heart had begun to hope for impossible things. She retreated to her small room without entering the library, sat on the edge of her narrow bed, and forced herself to examine the situation with ruthless clarity. William was a Marquess of ancient lineage and enormous wealth, a man who moved in the highest circles of power and influence, while she was a paid companion of 28 with no fortune, no family, and a face that prompted pity rather than admiration. That he had found her conversation interesting was pleasant but ultimately meaningless. Men of his rank often enjoyed intellectual discourse without it signifying romantic interest, and she had been absurd to read more into his attention than simple appreciation for a reasonably informed discussion partner. Miss Arabella Ashworth, meanwhile, possessed everything Eleanor lacked: youth, beauty, family connections, and the kind of polish that came from a lifetime of privilege and careful grooming for precisely such a match. Eleanor resolved with grim determination to protect what remained of her dignity by maintaining appropriate distance, by remembering her place and not presuming beyond it. And when William arrived 2 days later for what had become his customary afternoon visit, she excused herself from the library almost immediately after his entrance, citing urgent tasks that required her attention elsewhere, and she did not look back to see the confusion that crossed his features as she hurried from the room with her eyes fixed firmly on the floor. William noticed Eleanor's withdrawal immediately and found himself more than puzzled. He was troubled in a way that surprised him with its intensity, for he had come to value their conversations as the most genuine exchanges in his carefully constructed life, and her sudden absence from the library when he visited left the room feeling hollow despite its thousands of volumes. He spent a distracted evening attempting to understand what had changed, reviewing their last conversation for any misstep on his part, and it was only when his secretary made a casual comment about the beautiful Miss Ashworth being much discussed among the younger gentlemen of society that William experienced a sudden and uncomfortable recognition of his own carelessness, realizing with chagrin that he had been so focused on his own growing attachment to Eleanor that he had failed to consider how his frequent visits to the household might appear to her, what conclusions she might draw given the presence of Lady Ashworth's niece, and the inevitable gossip such visits would generate among servants and society alike. The thought that Eleanor might believe his attention had been mere politeness, or worse, that she might think herself merely incidental to visits intended for another, created a sharp discomfort in his chest that felt remarkably like panic, and he understood with sudden clarity that he needed to make his intentions unmistakable, not just to Eleanor, but to everyone in a position to influence her understanding of the situation. The following morning he called at the Ashworth residence at an unusually early hour and requested a private audience with Lady Ashworth, who received him with barely concealed delight, clearly anticipating a declaration regarding her niece, and he began by mentioning an upcoming lecture at the Royal Society on Agricultural Innovations that he thought might interest her household. Lady Ashworth looked momentarily confused by this opening until William continued smoothly, noting that Miss Whitmore in particular would likely find the subject fascinating given her evident interest in political economy and reform, and perhaps Lady Ashworth might permit her companion to attend as part of her party, an unprecedented request that would normally be dismissed, but which Lady Ashworth, operating under the mistaken assumption that William wished to create an opportunity to court Arabella in a more intellectual setting that would nevertheless include appropriate chaperonage, agreed to with an eagerness that would have been amusing had William not been so focused on ensuring Eleanor's attendance. He left the house with satisfaction, having secured what he needed, and spent the intervening days until the lecture crafting how he might use the occasion to demonstrate to Eleanor that his interest was specifically and unmistakably in her, that whatever gossip she might have heard was founded on society's inability to imagine a man of his position genuinely valuing a woman for qualities other than beauty and fortune, and that he intended to make his regard so clear that she could no longer doubt it, regardless of how such public attention might shock those who believed they understood the proper order of things. The lecture hall at the Royal Society was crowded with gentlemen of scholarly inclination, and a smaller number of ladies whose intellectual interests were tolerated, provided they attended with appropriate chaperones and maintained proper decorum, and Eleanor found herself seated at the end of the third row, separated from Lady Ashworth's main party by several seats, as befitted her position as companion rather than family, with Miss Arabella Ashworth positioned prominently in the centre of the group where her beauty could be properly displayed and admired. Eleanor had dressed with particular care that morning, knowing she would be in public, though no amount of care could transform her plain features or unremarkable figure into anything society would deem noteworthy, and she had resigned herself to an evening of intellectual pleasure, shadowed by the awareness that William would likely spend the lecture attentive to Miss Arabella, confirming what the eager servants' gossip had already told her about the true object of his interest. The speaker had just begun his remarks on innovations in crop rotation when Eleanor became aware of movement in the aisle beside her, and she glanced up to find William standing there, his tall frame blocking the view of several annoyed attendees behind him, and before she could fully process his presence, he had settled into the seat directly beside her, so close that she could smell the subtle scent of his shaving soap and feel the warmth radiating from his body. The murmur that rippled through the assembled crowd was immediate and unmistakable. Heads turning to observe the Marquess of Ravenscroft, choosing to sit not with Lady Ashworth's party, where the beautiful Miss Arabella sat looking suddenly confused and slighted, but beside the plain paid companion whom most people in the room would not have noticed had he not drawn such deliberate attention to her presence. Eleanor felt heat flood her face as she stared fixedly at the speaker, her heart hammering so violently she feared William must surely hear it, and when he leaned slightly toward her and murmured a question about whether she had read the speaker's recently published treatise on agricultural economics, his voice low and intimate, in a way that made her hands tremble in her lap, she could barely formulate a coherent response. Yet respond she did, because however mortifying this public attention might be, she could not bring herself to remain silent when he engaged her on a subject she found genuinely fascinating, and soon they were conversing in hushed tones about soil composition and yield improvements, while the lecture continued and the rest of the audience watched them with expressions ranging from shock to disapproval to avid curiosity. William seemed utterly oblivious to the stares, or perhaps more accurately, utterly indifferent to them. Asking Eleanor her opinion on various points the speaker raised, occasionally making a quiet observation that made her lips curve in involuntary amusement, and she found herself responding with the kind of unguarded insight she normally kept carefully hidden, offering perspectives drawn from her reading, and her own observations about the practical realities of agricultural life that most gentlemen never troubled to consider. She was aware of Lady Ashworth's rigid posture several seats away, of Miss Arabella's bewildered glances in their direction, of the whispers spreading through the rows behind them like fire through dry grass, and she knew with sick certainty that this public display of his attention would have consequences she could not begin to predict, that she was being observed and judged and found wanting by every person in this room who believed they understood how society should properly function, yet in this moment, with William's complete focus on her words and her thoughts and her presence beside him, she could not quite bring herself to wish she were anywhere else. The lecture concluded to polite applause, and as the attendees began to gather their belongings and form small conversational clusters, William rose from his seat and offered Eleanor a small bow before making his way through the dispersing crowd toward where Lady Ashworth stood with her niece, her expression a carefully maintained mask of composure that nonetheless betrayed an underlying tension visible in the rigid set of her shoulders and the tight line of her mouth. Eleanor remained seated, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white against the fabric of her gloves, watching as William approached her employer with the purposeful stride of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through, regardless of obstacles or objections. Lady Ashworth excused herself from the group surrounding Miss Arabella and moved to meet William at a slight distance, and though Eleanor could not hear their words, she could observe the progression of Lady Ashworth's reactions with a sick clarity that made her stomach twist with apprehension. The initial expression of pleased expectation, clearly anticipating some declaration regarding her beautiful niece. The sudden stillness as William spoke words that evidently surprised her. The visible shock that broke through her practiced social control, and finally a kind of stunned disbelief that would have been almost comical had Eleanor not been so thoroughly terrified about what was being discussed and what consequences would inevitably fall upon her own head. She told herself that she should look away, that observing this conversation served no purpose but to increase her anxiety. Yet she found herself unable to turn her gaze from William's face, noting the firm set of his jaw and the unwavering directness of his posture, the bearing of a man accustomed to command and wholly unaccustomed to having his stated intentions questioned or dismissed. Lady Ashworth was speaking now, gesturing in a manner that suggested both protest and explanation, her expression cycling through disbelief toward something approaching outrage, and Eleanor felt a wave of mortification wash over her as she realized with awful certainty that William must be speaking of her, that whatever was transpiring in that conversation concerned her directly, and that Lady Ashworth's reaction suggested the topic was both unexpected and thoroughly unwelcome. Other attendees were beginning to notice the intense discussion, glances darting toward the Marquess and Lady Ashworth with the avid curiosity of those who sensed drama unfolding and wished to witness every detail that might later be relayed as gossip. William said something else, his tone evidently sharp enough to carry even if the words did not, because Lady Ashworth actually took a small step backward, her face flushing with what might have been anger or perhaps something closer to intimidation, and Eleanor recognized in that moment the full force of William's position and authority being brought to bear, the weight of rank and consequence deployed not in casual conversation but in absolute determination. The exchange continued for several more minutes that felt to Eleanor like hours, each second stretching into an eternity of dread and confused hope, until finally William executed a formal bow and turned away, his eyes immediately seeking and finding Eleanor across the thinning crowd, and the expression on his face as their gazes met was one of such quiet satisfaction and unmistakable intent that her breath caught in her throat, even as Lady Ashworth stood frozen in place, staring after him with an expression that mingled shock with calculation, with something that might almost have been fear. Eleanor had been sitting in her small room adjacent to the servants' quarters when the summons came, delivered by a housemaid whose expression mingled curiosity with something approaching pity, and she had descended the stairs with a growing sense of dread that settled like cold stone in her stomach, knowing that whatever conversation awaited her in Lady Ashworth's private sitting-room would determine the immediate course of her future, and quite possibly leave her without employment or reference. Lady Ashworth was standing by the window when Eleanor entered, her posture rigid with an emotion Eleanor could not immediately identify. And when she turned to face her companion, her expression was a remarkable mixture of disbelief, calculation, and barely suppressed outrage that made Eleanor's hands begin to tremble where she clasped them before her. Lady Ashworth waved away Eleanor's curtsy with an impatient gesture and began speaking without preamble, her voice tight with an incredulity she made no effort to conceal, relating the conversation that had just transpired with the Marquess of Ravenscroft in terms that suggested she still could not quite believe the words she was reporting. The Marquess had requested formal permission to call upon Eleanor specifically, Lady Ashworth informed her, had declared his intention to court her with a view toward matrimony, had made this extraordinary statement with complete seriousness and apparent determination despite Lady Ashworth's entirely reasonable attempts to redirect his attention toward more suitable prospects. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly around her, her breath catching in her throat as her mind struggled to process information that seemed to belong to some fantastical story rather than her own plain existence, and she reached out blindly to steady herself against the back of a nearby chair. Lady Ashworth was still speaking, her words coming faster now, cataloguing with brutal honesty all the reasons why such an attachment was improbable, inadvisable, and almost certainly temporary. Eleanor's lack of fortune, her complete absence of connections, her age, which at 28 was well past the first bloom of youth, her appearance, which no one could describe as anything approaching beauty, her position as a paid dependent, which made any pretension to equality with a Marquess absurd on its face. "You must not allow yourself to harbour false hopes," Lady Ashworth declared, her tone hovering between warning and command, "because this is clearly some peculiar whim that will pass once the novelty wears thin, once he spends sufficient time in your company to realize the vast gulf between your circumstances and his expectations." Eleanor found her voice finally, though it emerged smaller than she intended, assuring Lady Ashworth that she had done nothing whatsoever to encourage the Marquess's attention, that she was as shocked by this development as anyone, that she understood perfectly well the improbability of such an attachment and harboured no illusions about her own value in society's eyes. Lady Ashworth studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the calculation working behind her employer's eyes, weighing the potential advantages of a connection to the Marquess against the presumption of a paid companion receiving such elevated attention. And finally, Lady Ashworth announced with obvious reluctance that she would grant permission for the Marquess to call under the strictest supervision, because to refuse might give offence to a man of such consequence, though she made it abundantly clear that she expected this strange fascination to fade quickly once William spent more time observing Eleanor's limitations and remembering the realities of their respective positions in the world. William sent word the following afternoon that he would call at 3 o'clock to take Miss Whitmore driving in Hyde Park, and when his elegant curricle arrived precisely at the appointed hour, Eleanor descended the front steps with Lady Ashworth watching from the doorway, with an expression that mingled scepticism with calculation, clearly expecting this spectacle to conclude in embarrassment that would end the entire peculiar episode. William handed Eleanor up into the seat beside him, with a courtesy that felt almost tender, his hand steadying hers with a warmth she could feel even through their gloves. And as they set off toward the park, she was acutely conscious of the picture they presented, the distinguished Marquess in his prime, and the plain paid companion with no beauty or fortune to recommend her, a pairing so improbable that it demanded explanation and invited speculation. The fashionable hour in Hyde Park was always well attended, and today seemed no exception as carriages lined the drives and riders paraded their mounts and pedestrians strolled the paths in a performance of social visibility where seeing and being seen constituted the primary purpose of attendance. Eleanor felt the stares begin the moment they entered the park, heads turning to track their progress, conversations pausing as they passed, the weight of collective attention like a physical pressure against her skin. William appeared utterly unconcerned, nodding to acquaintances with his usual reserved courtesy, occasionally lifting his hand in acknowledgement, but making no effort to stop for extended conversation, his attention returning always to Eleanor, asking her observations about the landscaping, the architecture visible beyond the trees, drawing her into dialogue that required her to respond and thus be seen speaking with him as though she had every right to his company. She heard the whispers, caught fragments of speculation carried on the spring breeze. What hold does she have over him? What arts did she employ? Surely this is some wager or peculiar whim. He cannot possibly be serious about such a woman. Two ladies she recognized from various social events where she had attended Lady Ashworth looked at her with expressions of such pitying condescension that Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, their gazes travelling from her unfashionable bonnet to her simple dress with an assessment that found her thoroughly wanting and clearly wondered what madness had possessed the Marquess. A group of gentlemen on horseback passed near enough that she heard one murmur something about charity cases and misplaced sympathy, followed by laughter that made her hands clench in her lap. William must have sensed her distress because he drew the curricle to a halt in a relatively quiet section of the drive, turning to face her with an expression of such serious concern that her breath caught. He asked quietly whether she wished him to cease this courtship, whether the attention and speculation were too painful to endure, his voice making clear that he would respect whatever answer she gave, though she could see the hope and determination in his eyes that suggested what answer he desired. Eleanor found herself confronting a choice that felt impossibly difficult: the safety of retreat into familiar invisibility versus the terrifying possibility of allowing herself to hope for something she had never imagined within her reach. She admitted in a voice barely above a whisper that she was afraid of becoming a spectacle, afraid of the cruelty that seemed to follow their every public appearance, but also afraid of losing his company, which had become precious to her in ways she hardly knew how to articulate. William reached across and took her hand where it rested in her lap, a gesture so deliberate and public that several passing carriages slowed to observe, and he promised with quiet intensity that he would prove his sincerity beyond any doubt society might cast, that she need only trust him long enough to demonstrate that his regard was neither whim nor charity, but genuine recognition of her extraordinary worth. William sent word to his sister within days, requesting that she return to London from her country house on a matter of some urgency, and when Lady Margaret Fleming arrived at his residence on a bright morning 3 days later, her expression mingled curiosity with sisterly concern, clearly wondering what circumstance required such immediate attention. William explained the situation with a directness that Margaret appreciated, telling her about Eleanor, about the courtship that had London society buzzing with speculation and judgment, about his determination to marry a woman the Ton considered entirely unsuitable for a man of his position. And as he spoke, Margaret watched her brother with growing fascination, noting the animation in his features and the conviction in his voice that she had not witnessed in years. Margaret agreed to meet Eleanor, though William could see the skepticism in her eyes, the protective wariness of a sister who had watched too many fortune hunters and social climbers attempt to ensnare eligible men, and he understood that Eleanor would face examination from perhaps the one person whose opinion truly mattered to him beyond his own judgment. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon at Lady Ashworth's residence, a tea that Lady Ashworth herself orchestrated with elaborate attention to propriety, clearly hoping that the formidable Lady Margaret would put an end to this inexplicable attachment and restore sense to the situation. Eleanor descended to the drawing-room with her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that this encounter might well determine whether William's courtship could continue or whether familial pressure would accomplish what social disapproval had not. Margaret was seated when Eleanor entered, a handsome woman in her middle 30s with her brother's intelligent eyes and an air of self-possession that came from both rank and the independence widowhood had granted her. And when Eleanor curtsied, Margaret's assessing gaze travelled over her with the frank evaluation of someone accustomed to judging character quickly and accurately. The first quarter hour proceeded with the painful formality of such occasions, Lady Ashworth dominating conversation with society gossip and observations clearly designed to highlight the vast distance between Eleanor's circumstances and the elevated sphere the Fleming family inhabited. Then Margaret, with the cool authority of her position, dismissed Lady Ashworth's offered refreshments and requested that she might speak with Miss Whitmore in the garden, just the two of them, a suggestion that was phrased as request, but carried the weight of command that Lady Ashworth could not refuse. In the garden, away from observation, Margaret's manner shifted from formal assessment to something approaching conspiratorial directness, and she asked Eleanor plainly what her intentions were toward William, whether she understood the scrutiny and difficulty that marrying so far above her station would entail, whether she possessed the strength to endure what society would inflict. Eleanor, with nothing to lose by honesty, responded with careful dignity that she had no designs on the Marquess, that his attention had been entirely unsought, that she understood perfectly well her own limitations and the improbability of the match, but that she had come to value his company and conversation above anything she had known in her circumscribed life, and if he truly wished to continue the acquaintance, despite all reasonable objections, she would not refuse him out of false modesty or excessive caution. Margaret studied her in silence for a long moment, and Eleanor bore the scrutiny without flinching, meeting the older woman's eyes with a steadiness born of having nothing left to prove and nothing more to lose. Then Margaret smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her reserved features, and declared that William had chosen well, that Eleanor possessed more genuine quality and honest intelligence than any woman currently parading through London ballrooms, and that she would be proud to call her sister if matters progressed as William clearly hoped. Margaret's endorsement opened doors that had been firmly closed, and within a fortnight, Eleanor found herself included in gatherings she would never have accessed as Lady Ashworth's companion, small dinner parties where conversation centered on ideas rather than gossip, salons where reformist thinkers debated the future of England's social structures, intimate musicales where the quality of thought mattered as much as the quality of performance. At one such dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Pemberton, Eleanor sat between William and a distinguished scholar of political economy, engaging in a discussion about rural poverty with an ease that would have seemed impossible mere weeks earlier, her observations drawn from genuine knowledge and careful reading meeting with nods of agreement and thoughtful response. She was beginning to believe, tentatively, that she might actually belong in these spaces when Lord Carstairs, a man known for his cutting wit and his rivalry with William over several parliamentary votes, leaned forward from across the table with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He remarked in a voice pitched to carry that it was remarkably charitable of William to provide Miss Whitmore with such opportunities for education and social elevation, that not every man of rank would take such an interest in the improvement of those less fortunate, the words structured as compliment but laden with implication that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the true meaning registered. The suggestion that William's courtship was an act of condescension, that she was a charity case being paraded as some sort of peculiar social experiment. And she saw Lady Pemberton's expression tighten with disapproval, though whether directed at Carstairs or at Eleanor herself was impossible to determine. Before Eleanor could formulate any response, before she could even fully process the humiliation spreading through her chest like ice water, William set down his wine-glass with such deliberate control that the small click of crystal on wood seemed loud in the sudden quiet. His voice, when he spoke, was colder than Eleanor had ever heard it, each word enunciated with a precision that made them cut deeper, and he addressed Lord Carstairs with the courtesy one might extend to something distasteful found on the sole of one's boot. William observed that it was indeed fortunate that society had men willing to champion education and elevation, as Lord Carstairs himself was living proof that birth and fortune alone could not compensate for the deficiencies in character, intelligence, or basic human decency, and perhaps if Carstairs had benefited from more charitable instruction in his youth, he might have learned that a man's worth is demonstrated not by whom he condescends to, but by whom he chooses to honor with his regard. The silence that followed was absolute, every person at the table frozen in shock at the systematic dismantling they had just witnessed, and William continued with relentless calm to enumerate Carstairs' recent political failures, his questionable financial dealings, his reputation for cruelty to servants and tenants, each observation delivered with devastating accuracy and barely restrained fury that made clear he was defending not abstract principle, but something personally precious to him. Eleanor sat motionless, mortified to be the cause of such a scene, yet also moved beyond words by the fierce protectiveness in William's defense, seeing in this moment the depth of feeling he had been too restrained by propriety to fully express. Lord Carstairs, face mottled with rage and embarrassment, rose from the table and quit the room without taking his leave, and after a beat of suspended shock, conversation resumed, though the atmosphere remained charged with the electricity of what everyone had witnessed, some guests looking at William with new respect, others exchanging glances that suggested confirmation of their suspicions about his strange obsession with an unsuitable woman. The dinner party concluded with strained civility, guests departing earlier than customary, the evening's tension having drained the pleasure from what remained of the occasion, and William escorted Eleanor back to Lady Ashworth's residence in his carriage, the silence between them thick with unspoken thoughts, until Eleanor finally murmured an apology for having caused such a scene, for having brought discord to what should have been a pleasant gathering. William turned to her in the dim interior, the passing street lamps casting moving shadows across his features, and told her with quiet intensity that she had caused nothing, that Lord Carstairs alone bore responsibility for his cruelty, and that William's only regret was that propriety prevented him from responding with the full force of his contempt for such behavior. Eleanor felt tears prickling behind her eyes, overwhelmed by the care evident in his defense, yet still shaken by the reminder of how precarious her position remained, how easily she could be reduced to an object of mockery and speculation. When they arrived at the Ashworth residence, William handed her down from the carriage, but did not immediately release her hand, and in a voice low enough that the coachman could not hear, he asked if she might grant him a few moments in the garden before she retired, if Lady Ashworth's proprieties would permit such a brief conversation. Eleanor nodded, her heart accelerating, and sent word inside that she would take a turn in the garden before coming in, knowing the servant would relay this to Lady Ashworth, and that technically William's presence was chaperoned by the proximity of the house and the servants within. They walked in silence along the gravel paths, the spring evening cool and fragrant with early roses, until they reached a bench partially hidden by a trellis of climbing jasmine, and there William stopped, turning to face her with an expression that held none of his usual careful control, his feeling written plainly across features that society knew as austere and unreadable. He began to speak, words coming with the hesitancy of a man unaccustomed to exposing his interior landscape, telling her that in the gallery of the House of Lords, when her laughter had cut through his practiced rhetoric, something had shifted in him, some long dormant recognition that his entire life had become a performance, every word calculated, every gesture measured against what was expected and appropriate for a man of his station. He confessed that he had not realized how starved he had been for something genuine, something unguarded and true, until that moment when her spontaneous amusement had reminded him that authenticity still existed somewhere in his carefully constructed world. Eleanor listened, scarcely breathing, as he continued, telling her that in their subsequent conversations he had discovered not merely intelligence or wit, though she possessed both in abundance, but a way of seeing the world that had reawakened his own capacity to perceive clearly, to question the assumptions that governed their society, to remember why he had entered political life in the first place with ideals about reform and justice. She tried to speak, to deflect this intensity of regard, murmuring something about being merely a woman with access to books and too much time for reading, but William reached out and took her hand, the touch sending electricity through her entire body, the impropriety of it shocking and thrilling in equal measure. He told her that she was not merely a woman with books, but someone who had taught him to see past the comfortable lies that men of his station told themselves, that in her company he had remembered what it meant to think rather than simply to calculate political advantage, and that her presence had become so essential to his daily existence that the thought of returning to the carefully managed emptiness of his previous life was unendurable. Eleanor felt tears spilling over despite her efforts at composure, and she whispered that she feared constantly that this connection between them was something fragile that would shatter under the weight of societal disapproval, that she would wake one morning to find him looking at her with regret, seeing finally what everyone else saw when they looked at her. A plain woman past her youth with nothing to recommend her but a modest education gained through the charity of an employer. William's grip on her hand tightened, and he said with a fierceness that startled her that she must never measure her worth by the standards of people who valued nothing but surfaces, that the very qualities society dismissed in her were precisely what made her irreplaceable to him, and that if she could not yet see her own value, she must trust him to see it for her until such time as she could perceive it herself. The words hung between them in the jasmine-scented air, and Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of self-protection she had carried for so many years. The armor that had kept her safe, but also kept her isolated from the very connection she had secretly longed for, even as she told herself such things were not meant for women like her. She looked up at William, seeing in his face an openness that society never witnessed. The public Marquess stripped away to reveal someone capable of uncertainty and hope and need, and she understood suddenly that her fear was not only about whether he would continue to value her, but about whether she had the courage to accept being valued, to step into a life she had never imagined possible. Before she could fully articulate this realization, the sound of an approaching carriage on the street beyond the garden wall reminded them both of the lateness of the hour and the proprieties they were already stretching by remaining alone together even in this semi-public space. William released her hand with obvious reluctance, and they walked back toward the house in silence. But it was a different quality of silence now, charged with understanding rather than uncertainty. At the door, he took his formal leave, bowing over her hand in a manner society would find perfectly proper, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that promised their conversation was far from finished, and Eleanor retreated inside with her heart still racing, knowing that something irrevocable had shifted between them. She had barely gained her room when the summons came. Lady Ashworth required her presence immediately, and Eleanor descended to the drawing-room with a sense of foreboding to find her employer pacing before the fireplace with a letter in hand, her expression a mixture of agitation and calculation that Eleanor had learned to recognize as the look of someone who had received unexpected news requiring rapid reassessment of strategy. Lady Ashworth informed her without preamble that the Dowager, Marchioness of Ravenscroft, had arrived in London that very evening, that she had sent word of her intention to call upon the household tomorrow morning, and that she had specifically requested a private audience with Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a summons that was effectively a command, and one that filled Eleanor with a dread so profound she felt her knees weaken beneath her skirts. The morning of Eleanor's audience with the Dowager Marchioness arrived with a persistent rain that drummed against the windows of Lady Ashworth's townhouse, and Eleanor dressed with trembling hands in her most respectable gown, a deep grey silk that Lady Ashworth had passed down to her the previous year, knowing that nothing she wore would truly satisfy the standards of a woman who had moved in the highest circles for decades, but hoping at least to present herself with dignity. The Dowager arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her carriage emblazoned with the Ravenscroft arms, and Eleanor was summoned immediately to the small receiving room where Lady Ashworth had arranged the meeting, her employer's expression a mixture of anxiety and calculation as she withdrew to leave Eleanor alone with a woman whose approval or disapproval could determine the entire course of her future. The Dowager Marchioness was a tall woman in her middle 60s with silver hair dressed impeccably and eyes of the same grey as her son's, though hers held a sharpness born of navigating decades of society's treacherous waters, and she subjected Eleanor to a long, assessing silence before gesturing for her to sit, the command implicit and absolute. Eleanor sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, refusing to fidget despite the terror coursing through her veins, and met the Dowager's gaze with as much steadiness as she could summon, knowing that any display of false modesty or grasping ambition would be instantly detected and despised. The Dowager's first question was direct and cutting, asking Eleanor what precisely she imagined her intentions were toward the Marquess of Ravenscroft, and whether she understood that her current circumstances made her spectacularly unsuitable for the position of Marchioness, a role that required not merely good character, but connections, experience, and the ability to navigate the complex social and political landscape that attended one of the oldest titles in England. Eleanor felt the words like blows, but forced herself to respond with honesty. saying that she had done nothing to seek the Marquess's attention, that she understood completely her unsuitability by every conventional measure, and that if his mother believed the attachment was harmful to him, Eleanor would remove herself from his life despite the pain it would cause her, because his welfare and happiness mattered more to her than her own desires. The dowager's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or approval, and she asked Eleanor to explain what she believed she could offer a man of William's position, rank, and responsibilities. Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts, then spoke quietly about conversations they had shared, about questions of reform and justice, about the way isolated privilege could blind even well-intentioned men to realities beyond their experience, and about her belief that she could offer him honesty, intellectual partnership, and a perspective shaped by living on the margins of the world he inhabited but had never truly seen from outside. She did not claim to be wise or experienced in society's ways, acknowledged frankly that she would make errors and face ridicule, but insisted that she would learn, work tirelessly, and bring to the role a genuine commitment to using whatever influence it granted her to improve the lives of those with far less power and security than she would possess as his wife. The dowager regarded Eleanor in silence for a long moment after this speech, her expression unreadable, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for judgment, knowing that this woman held the power to destroy whatever fragile hope had begun to grow between her and William, but refusing to retreat from the honesty that was perhaps the only thing of value she possessed to offer. Finally, the dowager spoke, her voice softer than before, saying that Eleanor's answer revealed more sense and genuine feeling than she had anticipated finding in a woman who might have been expected to dissemble or flatter, and that while she could not pretend to be entirely reconciled to her son's choice, she would not oppose it if Eleanor could demonstrate the strength of character to weather the storms that would inevitably come. She added, with a hint of something that might have been sympathy, that being a marchioness was not merely a matter of wearing fine gowns and presiding over elegant dinners, that it required resilience, political acumen, the ability to smile while being eviscerated by other women's malice, and the wisdom to know when to bend and when to stand immovable. And she asked Eleanor directly whether she believed herself capable of developing these qualities. Eleanor met the older woman's gaze and said quietly that she did not know if she possessed such capabilities, that she had never been tested in ways that would reveal whether she had that kind of strength, but that she loved William enough to try, to learn, to fail and try again, and that she would rather attempt something difficult and meaningful than continue in the safe mediocrity of her current existence. The dowager's lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile, and she said that this answer, at least, was honest, and that perhaps honesty was a quality sufficiently rare in their world to compensate for other deficiencies. She rose, indicating the interview was concluded, and Eleanor stood as well, her legs trembling slightly, but holding her upright. The dowager moved toward the door, then paused and turned back, saying that William's grandmother, whose ring Eleanor would wear if this marriage proceeded, had been very much like Eleanor herself, a woman of no particular fortune or beauty who had nonetheless become one of the most respected women of her generation through force of character and genuine compassion, and that the dowager hoped Eleanor would prove worthy of that legacy. With that, she departed, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the small receiving room, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and terror and something like hope, understanding that she had not won enthusiastic approval, but had at least not been rejected outright. Lady Ashworth appeared moments later, her face tight with curiosity and anxiety, demanding to know what had transpired, but Eleanor found she could not adequately explain the complexity of the conversation, could only say that the dowager had not forbidden the match. That evening, William called, and Eleanor was permitted a brief supervised conversation in which she related the essential facts of the interview, watching his face transform with relief and something deeper, a gratitude that he would not have to choose between his mother's blessing and his own heart's conviction. The engagement announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days after Eleanor accepted William's proposal, and London society erupted with reactions ranging from romantic admiration to scandalized outrage, with the latter significantly outweighing the former, as drawing rooms across Mayfair filled with speculation about what hold the plain, penniless companion could possibly have over one of England's most eligible peers. Eleanor received the news of the announcement while sitting in Lady Ashworth's breakfast room, and though William had warned her to expect strong reactions, the reality of seeing their names linked in print made her hands tremble as she set down her teacup, understanding that she had now become a public figure subject to scrutiny and judgment from thousands who had never met her and would assess her solely through the lens of their prejudices. The letters began arriving that same afternoon, some congratulatory, but many anonymous and vicious, warning her that she was making a fool of herself and would be abandoned once the Marquess tired of his peculiar experiment, suggesting in cruel detail all the ways she was inadequate for the position she presumed to occupy, and though Eleanor tried to burn them unread, their mere existence felt like poison seeping into her confidence. Lady Ashworth's attitude shifted dramatically between viewing Eleanor as a potential source of elevated connections and resenting that her paid companion would soon outrank her, resulting in a confusing mixture of false warmth and barely concealed irritation that made the household increasingly uncomfortable for Eleanor as she counted the days until she could leave it forever. The formal engagement ball was scheduled for the following week at the home of Lady Margaret Fleming, who had insisted on hosting despite knowing it would attract every gossip and social climber in London, believing that facing society united would be better than allowing speculation to fester unchallenged. Eleanor dressed for the ball with a sense of walking toward execution, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that William had commissioned for her, far finer than anything she had ever owned, yet she felt exposed rather than elegant as Lady Ashworth's carriage delivered her to the Fleming residence, where lights blazed from every window and the street was crowded with elegant equipages. William was waiting in the entrance hall, and the moment their eyes met, Eleanor felt some of her terror ease, but as they entered the ballroom together and conversation died in spreading waves of silence before erupting in furious whispers, she felt the weight of hundreds of hostile and curious stares like physical pressure against her skin. She maintained her composure through the receiving line and the first dances, but when she stepped away briefly to catch her breath, she found herself near a group of women who either did not see her or did not care that she could hear them discussing in voices dripping with false sympathy how tragic it was that poor Lord Ravenscroft had developed such an inexplicable attachment to someone so utterly unsuitable, speculating whether he had suffered some kind of mental affliction or was perhaps being manipulated through means they would not name in polite company, but which their tone made clear were sordid. Eleanor felt something crack inside her, the fragile confidence she had been building shattered by the casual cruelty, and she retreated quickly through the terrace doors into the cool night air, where she stood gripping the stone balustrade with shaking hands, fighting tears and the terrible conviction that she was indeed making a catastrophic mistake that would ruin not just her own life, but William's reputation and happiness. William found her on the terrace within moments, as though he had been watching and waiting for the precise instant when her composure would fail, and he came through the doors with such purpose that she knew he had seen everything, understood everything, felt everything she was feeling in that moment of doubt and pain. He did not speak immediately, did not offer the comforting words she half expected, but instead held out his hand with a look of such fierce determination that she placed her trembling fingers in his almost without conscious thought, and he drew her back toward the ballroom with steady resolve, saying quietly that the next dance was a waltz, and he intended to claim it with her before all of London. Eleanor tried to protest, saying she needed a moment to compose herself, that she could not face those women again so soon, but William's grip on her hand was gentle yet unyielding as he led her to the edge of the ballroom floor just as the orchestra began the opening strains of the waltz, and before she could retreat, he had placed one hand at her waist and drawn her into the dance, into the center of the room where every eye could see them, where there was no possibility of hiding or being overlooked. He held her with unmistakable tenderness, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, his other hand cradling hers with a gentleness that seemed to contradict the steel in his eyes as he gazed down at her. And as they began to move, Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of stares like heat against her skin. But William seemed utterly oblivious to everyone except her, speaking in low tones that only she could hear, telling her that she looked beautiful tonight, that the blue of her gown made her eyes luminous, that he had never been more proud to stand beside anyone in his life. The room seemed to shift around them as they turned, other couples giving them space as though they moved in their own sphere, and Eleanor found herself responding to his lead with increasing confidence, her body remembering the dancing lessons of her youth, her feet finding the rhythm as William continued speaking, his voice a steady anchor against the storm of her emotions, telling her specific things he loved about her, the way her mind worked through problems, the dry humor that surfaced when she felt safe, the compassion she showed even to those who had hurt her, the courage it took for her to accept his proposal, knowing what would follow. Eleanor felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different, not born of humiliation, but of overwhelming feeling. And she looked up into his face and saw there such open devotion, such absolute certainty, that something shifted in her chest, some final wall crumbling as she allowed herself to truly believe that this was real, that he truly saw her and chose her and would continue choosing her regardless of what society thought. Around them, she became dimly aware that the quality of attention had changed, that some of the hostility had transmuted into something else, curiosity perhaps, or even grudging admiration, as though William's unwavering focus on her was forcing a reassessment of her worth in the minds of those watching. And when the music ended and he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture of unmistakable romantic devotion, she heard a smattering of applause that grew until it filled the ballroom. Not universal, certainly, but real, and she understood that they had crossed some invisible threshold together, that by refusing to hide or apologize, they had claimed space that could not now be easily taken back. The weeks following the engagement ball transformed into a whirlwind of wedding preparations that Eleanor had never imagined herself experiencing, and William insisted on involving her in every decision from the selection of flowers to the guest list to the music that would be performed during the ceremony, treating her opinions not as those of a bride to be indulged, but as those of an equal partner, whose preferences mattered as much as his own. He appeared at Lady Ashworth's residence nearly every day, sometimes with practical matters to discuss, such as arrangements for Eleanor's belongings to be transported to Ravenscroft Hall, but more often simply to spend time with her, to walk in the small garden behind the house or sit in the library where their connection had first deepened. And during these visits, he would produce gifts that revealed how closely he had been attending to her interests and passions. The gifts were not jewels or expensive trinkets, though he certainly provided those as well, but rather first editions of books she had mentioned wanting to read, tickets to lectures at the Royal Society on topics he knew would fascinate her, and on one memorable afternoon, an introduction to a prominent reformist member of Parliament who had been working on legislation regarding workers' rights, and who seemed genuinely delighted to meet Eleanor and discuss her ideas about education and social welfare with a seriousness that left her both exhilarated and slightly dazed. William watched these interactions with visible satisfaction, as though each person who recognized Eleanor's intellect and worth validated something he had known from the beginning. And gradually, Eleanor found herself standing differently, speaking with more confidence, no longer reflexively apologizing for her presence or her opinions, the years of training herself to be invisible and inoffensive beginning to fall away like an ill-fitting garment she had worn too long. Lady Ashworth's behavior during this period oscillated wildly between attempts to insinuate herself into the wedding preparations as though she were Eleanor's beloved patroness rather than her employer, and moments of barely concealed resentment that her paid companion would soon outrank her and could no longer be ordered about or dismissed at whim. And Eleanor observed this performance with a mixture of pity and private amusement, understanding that Lady Ashworth was responding to shifting power dynamics in the only way her limited imagination allowed. The transformation in Eleanor was not physical, precisely, though the fine clothes William insisted on commissioning certainly made a difference, but rather something more fundamental, a shift in bearing that came from being truly seen and valued, from having someone like William look at her each day as though she were precious and brilliant and essential to his happiness. She caught herself smiling more readily, engaging in conversation with less hesitation, offering opinions without waiting for permission, and while the old reflexes of self-doubt still surfaced, especially when confronted with society's continuing skepticism, they no longer had the power to overwhelm her because William's steady presence and unwavering regard provided a foundation strong enough to stand on even when the ground felt uncertain beneath her feet. The wedding took place on a golden afternoon in late summer when the light slanted through the windows of St. George's Church in Hanover Square with the quality of amber honey, illuminating the assembled guests who represented a cross-section of London society, from the highest ranks of nobility to the reformist thinkers and politicians who had come to value Eleanor's mind and passion for social justice. Eleanor stood in the vestibule in a gown that William had commissioned specifically for her, not the heavily embellished creation that fashion dictated, but rather a design of simple elegance in ivory silk that draped beautifully over her slender frame, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and sleeves that caught the light without overwhelming her features. And when William had first seen the design, he had told the modiste that he wanted something that would complement Eleanor's colouring and allow her natural grace to shine through rather than compete with ornamentation. Her hair was dressed simply with small white roses woven through the dark strands, and she wore the pearl earrings that had belonged to William's grandmother, the woman whose ring now waited to be placed on her finger, and as she prepared to walk down the aisle on the arm of Lord Pemberton, a distant cousin who had agreed to give her away since she had no male relations of her own, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment settling over her like a tangible presence, the understanding that she was about to step into an identity she had never imagined possible for someone like her. The music swelled, and she began the long walk toward the altar where William stood waiting, and she could see even from a distance the way his entire attention focused on her with an intensity that made the crowded church fade into insignificance. And as she drew closer, she saw that his eyes were bright with emotion, his expression one of such open joy and certainty that her own nervousness dissolved into a matching happiness that rose in her chest until she felt she might overflow with it. They stood before the Archbishop together and spoke the ancient vows, William's voice steady and sure as he promised to love and cherish her, to honor her above all others. And when Eleanor's turn came, her voice was quieter but equally certain, no tremor of doubt as she pledged herself to this man who had seen past every barrier society had erected around her worth and chosen her with deliberate, unwavering conviction. The moment came when William was instructed to kiss his bride, and he cupped her face gently between his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that nonetheless communicated the depth of his feeling, and genuine applause rose from the assembled guests, including some of the very people who had initially sneered at the match, but who had been gradually won over by the obvious devotion between them. And as William drew back and looked into her eyes with a smile that transformed his usually austere features, Eleanor felt the full reality settle over her like a mantle both heavy and precious, that she was no longer Eleanor Whitmore, but Eleanor Thornhill, Marchioness of Ravenscroft, a title that seemed impossible and yet was now irrevocably hers. The wedding breakfast took place in the grand ballroom of Ravenscroft House, William's London residence, where long tables had been arranged and decorated with white roses and trailing ivy, and the morning light streamed through tall windows illuminating the assembled guests, who represented the complex social terrain that Eleanor now found herself navigating as the new Marchioness of Ravenscroft. She stood beside William receiving congratulations and well wishes, and it was impossible not to notice the shift in how people approached her, the calculation in eyes that had previously dismissed her as beneath notice, the smiles that were now offered with deference rather than condescension, and she realized with a mixture of irony and something darker that many of these same people who now sought her favor had been among those whispering cruelty about her only weeks before. Lady Pemberton, who had made a particularly cutting remark about Eleanor's plain appearance at the engagement ball, now gushed about how lovely the ceremony had been and how she had always thought the Marquess showed excellent judgment in all matters, and Eleanor responded with perfect courtesy, layered with just enough dry observation in her tone that William, standing close enough to hear, had to suppress a smile. Lord Hastings, who had questioned William's sanity in choosing such an unhateable bride, now spoke earnestly about his own interest in social reform and hoped the Marchioness might advise him on establishing a school for tenants' children on his estate, and Eleanor promised to send him information while privately noting how quickly principle could be discovered when advantage beckoned. Throughout the breakfast, William remained close to her side, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back or her elbow, small gestures of connection and support that communicated his awareness of how strange and overwhelming this must be for her. And whenever their eyes met, his expression conveyed such open pride and devotion that Eleanor felt fortified against the falseness surrounding them. Lady Margaret moved through the crowd with strategic purpose, drawing certain guests into conversation with Eleanor, women of intelligence and independence, who responded genuinely to Eleanor's ideas rather than merely her new rank. And gradually, Eleanor found herself engaged in several fascinating discussions about education reform and the rights of working women that made the ordeal of the breakfast feel almost worthwhile. When the time finally came for them to depart for Ravenscroft Hall, the crowd that had gathered outside to witness their leaving was larger than Eleanor had anticipated, and as William handed her into the carriage, she heard cheers rising from the assembled people, genuine warmth in the sound rather than mere obligation, and she realized that perhaps some portion of society had been moved by their story, by the idea that affection and respect might matter more than fortune and beauty. The carriage pulled away and William took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and Eleanor looked at him, this man who had chosen her so deliberately and loved her so completely, and she realized that the fear that had been her constant companion for so many years, the certainty that she was not enough and never would be, had finally and fully released its hold on her heart. Ravenscroft Hall rose before Eleanor like something from a dream, all golden stone and mullioned windows catching the late afternoon sun as the carriage turned up the long drive lined with ancient oaks that had witnessed centuries of Thornhill history, and as they drew closer, she could see the gardens stretching out in formal patterns that gradually gave way to parkland where sheep grazed peacefully, and beyond that, the fields where tenant farmers worked the land that sustained this entire community of perhaps 200 souls, all looking to the Marquess for leadership, and now, impossibly, to her as well. William watched her face as she took in her new home, and squeezed her hand gently, telling her that he wanted her to change anything that did not suit her, that this was her house now as much as his, and Eleanor felt the weight of that responsibility settle over her, even as she marveled at the beauty of it all. The household staff stood assembled to greet them, a long line of servants from the aged butler Mr. Harrison, who had served William's father, to the youngest kitchen maid, who could not have been more than 12, and Eleanor greeted each one with careful attention, aware that these people would be watching her closely, measuring her worthiness to stand as mistress of this place, and she saw surprise in some faces as she addressed them with genuine courtesy, rather than the distant condescension they might have expected. Over the first weeks, William made good on his promise to include her fully in the management of the estate, taking her on tours of the tenant farms where she met families who had worked this land for generations, and Eleanor listened carefully to their concerns about drainage in the lower fields and the need for repairs to cottages and the worry that their children had limited access to education that might offer them choices beyond farm labor. She met Mrs. Dawson, who was widely respected as a healer, but who worked with limited supplies and no formal training, and Eleanor began to envision a small clinic that could serve the community with proper medical care. William encouraged every idea she proposed, discussed implementation with her as an equal partner, valued her observations about what the tenants needed because she listened to them in ways that his steward, competent though he was, had not thought to do. In the evenings they dined together in the smaller family dining room rather than the grand formal space, and afterward they would retire to the library that was quickly becoming Eleanor's favorite room in the house, a beautiful space with floor-to-ceiling shelves and comfortable chairs drawn near the fire, and there they would read together or discuss the improvements they planned or simply sit in companionable silence that felt as intimate as conversation. In their private chambers, William's devotion expressed itself in tender exploration as they learned the language of physical intimacy, and Eleanor discovered that her body, which she had always thought plain and unremarkable, could be a source of profound pleasure and connection. That William touched her with reverence and desire that made her feel beautiful in ways she had never imagined possible, and in those moments of vulnerability and closeness, she understood that they were building something rare and precious, a marriage that was truly a partnership of equals bound by respect and passion and the deep recognition of kindred spirits who had found each other against all probability. Months passed in a rhythm that Eleanor had never imagined possible, the seasons turning at Ravenscroft Hall as she found herself absorbed in work that mattered more than she could have anticipated, work that drew on everything she had learned in her years of invisible observation and voracious reading. She established a school for the tenant children in a renovated barn that William helped her transform into a bright, welcoming space with windows and proper desks, and she hired a young teacher named Miss Bentley, who shared her conviction that education was the surest path to expanding opportunity. The mothers of the estate came to her with gratitude that sometimes moved Eleanor to tears, telling her that their daughters might now have choices beyond service or farm labor, that their sons might learn skills to manage their own holdings with greater knowledge. She worked with Mrs. Dawson to create a proper clinic stocked with medicines and basic medical supplies, and together they began training 2 younger women in healing arts so that the knowledge would not be lost when Mrs. Dawson grew too old to continue her work. William supported every initiative with resource and genuine enthusiasm, attending the school opening and praising the children's recitations, consulting with Eleanor on improvements to tenant cottages that would make them healthier and more comfortable, encouraging her to think boldly about what might be possible. They began hosting gatherings at the hall that were unlike the typical country house parties, inviting reformers and writers and political thinkers who engaged in passionate discussions about improving conditions for working people, and Eleanor discovered that she could hold her own in these conversations, that her perspective from the margins of society gave her insights that others valued. Her reputation began to shift beyond the immediate county, mentions appearing in letters and journals that circulated among reform-minded circles, and she received correspondence from women she had never met, thanking her for demonstrating that worthiness could take forms society had been too narrow to recognize. One letter in particular moved her deeply, from a woman of 35 who had resigned herself to permanent spinsterhood and invisibility, but who wrote that seeing Eleanor's story gave her courage to believe her own life might yet hold unexpected possibilities. Eleanor shared the letter with William one evening in the library, and he looked at her with such tenderness and told her that she had become exactly what he had seen in her from that first moment, that she was not changed but revealed, her essential self finally given room to flourish without the crushing weight of others' dismissal. They hosted Lady Margaret frequently, and she became Eleanor's dearest friend and advisor, helping navigate the remaining social complexities and championing Eleanor's work in London circles, where her voice carried weight. The estate itself seemed to respond to Eleanor's attention, not through any mystical transformation, but through the practical reality that people who felt valued and cared for worked with greater investment and innovation, and the yields improved while the atmosphere of the tenant community shifted toward something more hopeful and collaborative. A year after the wedding, Eleanor discovered she was with child, and the news brought a joy so profound it frightened her in its intensity. This sense that she had been given more happiness than any one person deserved, and with the joy came a wave of reflection on the improbable chain of events that had led her to this moment when she stood at the window of the library at Ravenscroft Hall with William's child growing beneath her heart. She found herself returning again and again to that afternoon in Parliament, the moment when propriety had failed her, and she had laughed aloud at the irony she could not contain, the sound carrying through the gallery to reach the man who would become her husband, and she marveled at how a single unguarded instant had altered the trajectory of her entire existence in ways she could never have imagined when she had been merely Miss Whitmore, paid companion, invisible and resigned to remaining so. William found her there one afternoon in early autumn when the light slanted golden through the windows and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and he came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms gently around her thickening waist, and asking with that tender concern she had come to rely upon what thoughts occupied her so completely. She leaned back against him and told him she had been thinking about fate, about the strangeness of how one moment could cascade into such profound consequences, how if she had managed to suppress that laugh, or if he had not looked up at precisely that instant, or if any of 1,000 small details had been different, they would not be standing here now with this future unfolding before them. His response was immediate and characteristically direct as he turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders, and told her it was not fate, but truth that had brought them together, that her laugh had been her authentic self breaking through the suffocating layers of propriety and performance that society demanded, and that sound of genuine unguarded response had allowed him to see her truly, to recognize in her something he had not known he was searching for until that precise moment. He said that she had not simply disrupted his speech, but had disrupted his understanding of what mattered, what was real, what he wanted from his life, and that in seeing her clearly, he had finally been able to see himself with equal clarity, to understand that he had been performing a role rather than living with authenticity. Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to him speak with such conviction, and she admitted that she had been so afraid for so long that he would wake one day and see her as others did, that the spell would break and he would realize he had bound himself to someone unworthy. But time and his unwavering devotion had gradually convinced her that what they had built together was real and enduring, founded on genuine recognition rather than illusion. He wiped her tears with his thumbs and kissed her forehead, and told her that the child she carried was proof of the life they were creating together, a life built on truth and partnership, and the courage to defy the narrow judgments of a society that valued appearance over substance, and that he could not wait to teach their son or daughter that worth came from character and integrity, rather than from the arbitrary accidents of birth or beauty or fortune. Several years had passed since that afternoon in Parliament, when Eleanor's laugh had carried across the gallery and changed the course of her life, and now she sat in the library at Ravenscroft Hall with her journal open before her, and the sound of her children playing in the garden drifting through the open windows, their voices bright with the unself-conscious joy that only the very young and the very secure possess. Thomas was 4 now, serious and thoughtful like his father, and Catherine had just turned 2, already showing signs of the spirited independence that William delighted in encouraging, and as Eleanor listened to them, she reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment when she was no longer Miss Whitmore the invisible companion, but Lady Ravenscroft, wife and mother and reformer, a woman whose voice carried weight in circles that once would never have acknowledged her existence. She thought often of the woman she had been, resigned to a life at the margins, convinced that her worth was measured accurately by society's dismissive gaze, and she wanted to reach back through time to tell that younger self that she had been wrong, that the limitations she had accepted were imposed rather than inherent, that a single moment of authentic response could crack open possibilities she had not dared to imagine. She knew there were countless other women living now as she once had, trapped by circumstances and society's narrow definitions of value, women who had learned to make themselves small and quiet and invisible because that was the only safety available to them, and she hoped that her story might offer them something precious. Not a promise that a Marquess would rescue them, but rather the deeper truth that their worth existed independent of recognition, that being seen began with refusing to hide. The work she had done on the estate, the school and the clinic and the improved cottages, mattered to her more than any social triumph, because it represented the truth William had helped her understand. That value lay in how one treated those with less power, in using whatever advantages one possessed to expand opportunity rather than to fortify privilege. She set down her pen and walked to the window, watching William crouch down to examine something Thomas had found in the garden, his patience and attention as focused on their son as it had once been on her in those early library conversations, and her heart swelled with gratitude for this man who had looked past every surface judgment to see her truly, and who had loved her not despite her ordinariness, but through it to the extraordinary person she had always been beneath society's dismissive labels. If you are listening to this story and find yourself in circumstances that feel limiting, if you have been told in 1,000 ways that you are not enough, not young enough, or beautiful enough, or wealthy enough, or remarkable enough to deserve the life you secretly long for, I want you to know that those judgments are lies built on a foundation of arbitrary standards designed to maintain hierarchies rather than to recognize truth. Your authentic self, the person you are when you forget to perform the role society demands, that self is worthy of love and recognition and a future that honors your particular gifts and perspectives. And it is never too late for transformation, never too late for someone to see you clearly and choose you deliberately, never too late to build a life that feels true rather than resigned. Subscribe to hear more stories of unlikely triumph and enduring love, stories that remind us all that happy endings are not reserved for those who fit narrow molds, but are available to anyone brave enough to let their authentic self break through, anyone willing to laugh when laughter rises unbidden, anyone ready to be seen.